Thank you, Charis. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about a proposed set of architectures for data sharing, and we plan to use OpenIMIS. So my outline will be My outline will be a brief discussion about AeHIN's Mind the Gaps framework, and then something about the AeHIN OpenIMIS Community of Practice program, and then I'll be describing each of the GAPS, and then some next steps that we can do to convert the proposed architecture for data sharing into real life projects. But first, let me talk about why data sharing is difficult in real life in the healthcare sector. Dr. Bunchay Kijsanayotin, our chair, has a much better slide about the challenges of data sharing, and he has this 5-layer interoperability graphic that shows that for interoperability to work, you need to have interoperability happening at different layers of the architecture, from business strategy to process to syntax to semantics. And to me, I have a simpler set of reasons. The most common reason is that if there's no legitimate purpose for data exchange between parties, then that will make data sharing very difficult. If the benefit of data sharing is not balanced and it's in favor of only one of the parties sharing data, then that won't work as well. If one party has good risk management and are able to protect their data, but the other party cannot show good risk management and is not able to show that they can actually protect the data that has been shared with them, that will make data sharing difficult. That will also result in the lack of trust between the parties. And I'd like to emphasize that if there's really no clear design or blueprint on how the data sharing is supposed to happen, then there will be a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty about how data sharing is actually managed, and people will be reluctant to share data if there's no clear blueprint. So some of you might be already familiar with AeHIN's Mind the Gaps framework. GAPS actually represents governance, architecture, program management, and standards. And we are recommending this Mind the Gaps framework for all our AeHIN country members to adopt, as it simplifies the things that they need to do to build and scale their digital health solutions nationwide. Next slide, please. So let me go through them one by one. For governance, we define this as the set of people, policies, and procedures that enable stakeholders to achieve a common purpose. And in this case, we're talking about the common purpose of data sharing. This is actually the most important and most difficult of all steps because it involves people. It involves people who have to make decisions, who have to make investments, and who have to take risks. And what we have seen is that the more stakeholders involved slash people, then the harder it becomes because you need to obtain consensus from all the stakeholders for data sharing to happen. Trust is a very important enabler. And if you have two people, then you only have to establish trust between two parties. But if you have more than two, maybe three or more than three stakeholders involved in the decision-making process, then it becomes an n times n minus 1 problem very quickly. So the more people involved and engaged in the data sharing process, the more complex it becomes. Not adding to that would be the privacy laws, and the privacy laws that are emerging from the different Asian countries adds complexity to the data sharing process. But as a matter of fact, it also provides the rules for assurance for parties on how data sharing should happen. And for the governance part of a data sharing um, exchange between parties, we think that an important artifact is a data sharing agreement, which I'll be discussing later on. After you have a data sharing agreement, which is the output of your governance, then you have to have an architecture or a blueprint. This is actually part of the data sharing agreement, the architecture of how data will be extracted from one system and transferred to another system, and how it will be imported into that second system. Without an architecture, stakeholders do not know what they're supposed to do to achieve the purpose of the sharing agreement. But with an architecture, there is clarity on what needs to be built and who is responsible for what. As a bonus, if there is an architecture for the data sharing, then security is easier to assure because the architecture will show how data is extracted from one system and imported to a second system, as opposed to not having an architecture and just telling people to trust the system without showing them in a transparent way how data is actually managed from system A to system B. So architecture is an important component in um, showing transparency and assuring stakeholders on how data is managed from system A to system B. With the architecture or a blueprint, it becomes transparent to the different stakeholders what they're supposed to do. And this is where we are able to ensure that every stakeholder with a responsibility in the architecture is actually capable of completing their assigned part. If the architecture is well designed, it can manage the risk of certain stakeholders failing in their performance of their part of the architecture. But if you have a good architecture and good program management, then responsible stakeholders who are capable of delivering their part of the architecture can still benefit from data sharing agreements with other as responsible stakeholders. So in a environment where there are 3 or more stakeholders with a data sharing agreement, even if one of the 3 stakeholders fail, then the remaining 2 who are able to manage their programs can still share data amongst themselves. And if each stakeholder can do its part, data sharing as architected will happen, and the original purpose, which is defined in the data sharing agreement, will be achieved. Standards and interoperability are important if we wish stakeholders to be able to understand and use data coming from an external system. If system A is standards compliant and system B is standards compliant, then it becomes easier for each of them to communicate with each other. And when you have more than 2 systems, when you have 3 or 4 or 5 systems that are standards compliant, then you are able to build an ecosystem of data sharing very quickly, and you are enabling an environment of innovation. And because of this, new transactions that create value amongst the stakeholders can be more easily developed. And for this particular area of standards, AeHIN and the Standards and Interoperability Lab Asia are looking at the different standards of the Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise, or IHE, HL7, and SNOMED, to name a few. So how do we use the Mind the Gaps framework in data sharing projects? So we hope that the countries who are now interested in creating data sharing capabilities within their own current countries would adopt the Mind the Gaps framework. And for this particular example, we wish to leverage the AeHIN OpenIMIS community of practice to demonstrate how to use Mind the Gaps for data sharing. For those who are not yet familiar with the AeHIN OpenIMIS community of practice, AeHIN received a certain amount of funds or a grant from GIZ to build capability for OpenIMIS understanding and implementation amongst interested AeHIN countries. So we already have Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka and Nepal who are part of the community of practice. So in these countries, we are able to identify people who are interested in OpenIMIS, and we have identified some projects that they can do together to demonstrate how OpenIMIS can work for them. Okay, so in the AeHIN OpenIMIS community of practice, specifically for the Philippines, we have the St. Luke's College of Medicine and the University of the Philippines, who are members of the community of practice. One artifact that we can and we plan to do with these two schools is to come up with a data sharing agreement for their OpenIMIS instances. So each of these countries, by virtue of the GIZ grant, will be able to have their own cloud-based OpenIMIS systems. There will be separate OpenIMIS systems which will be used by the two schools of medicine to teach principles of electronic medical records management to their students. But one such artifact that we can do after this webinar is to ask them if they can undertake a data sharing agreement between their respective OpenIMIS, and if they can share patient data across their OpenIMIS instances. And here we can limit our data sharing into the patient demographics, diagnosis, and active medications to keep it simple. There are different types of architectures that can be used in this data sharing experiment, so to speak. There can be a point-to-point data exchange, or architecture one, or architecture two would be to create a proprietary interface between the OpenIMIS of St. Luke's and the University of the Philippines. Another is to adopt the cross-document sharing format of the Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise, or IHE XDS. This is a profile in the IHE.net website, which will show how documents can be exchanged between SLMC and UP OpenIMIS systems. Or we can use the fourth architecture, which is HL7 Fire, to exchange data between St. Luke's and UP. And architecture 5 will be, oh, this is the old slide. Architecture 5 would be a full-blown open HIE architecture, where we will then implement the interoperability layer between St. Luke's and UP using interfaces from IHE and HL7. So next slide. I think these are the old set of slides. So maybe, Charisse, you can open the current slides. I think this is something that you downloaded earlier today. So the next steps would be, once the OpenIMIS of St. Luke's is installed, and once the OpenIMIS of the University of the Philippines is installed, we will be performing cross-document sharing and HL7 file sharing architectures 3 and 4 between these two systems, and monitor the performance of either system, regardless of whether we use architecture 3 or architecture 4. A data sharing agreement between St. Luke's and the University of the Philippines is necessary. So we hope to also document what are the challenges that are faced by entities when they need to share data between institutions. And we think that even if the technologies are already available, a lot of the challenges are not actually in the technical aspects of the data sharing, but actually in the governance aspects of the data sharing. So we hope that in the monthly AeHIN OpenIMIS webinars, we will have a 5 to 10 minute update on the data sharing experiment, as we call it now, and give you feedback on what is happening, and open up the experiment for your questions. So I'd like to end there and open the session for questions coming from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Alvin. So, to all our participants, if you have questions or clarifications, please feel free to send us a message. We have our first question, Dr. Alvin. This is from Dr. Pradeep Balachandran. In case of any data sharing agreement breach occurring across inter-country health data exchange networks, does the governance component of GAPS framework include a legal policy sub-framework to support data federation readdressal?
Thank you for that question, Pradeep. As usual, you have asked a very important question. Initially, we were planning to use the DURSA, or the Data Use and Reciprocal Sharing Agreement of the Sequoia project in the US. For those who are not yet familiar with Project Sequoia, it is actually an interoperability project. And to enable the interoperability project, they came up with a very, very long and lengthy DURSA, or DURSA, Data Use and Reciprocal Sharing Agreement. I would encourage you to Google Project Sequoia and DURSA to see for yourself what is inside a data use and reciprocal sharing agreement. And if you agree with me, after reading through the DURSA, you can see that it is a very, very tedious document. And we were hoping that this particular data sharing agreement that we would undertake for this data sharing experiment would be simpler, or we would actually open the question to other AeHIN members who are already using such kinds of data sharing agreements. And we would then show it to the St. Luke's College of Medicine and the University of the Philippines and ask them to evaluate which ones they feel comfortable using. I think breach is a very important aspect of any data sharing agreement. And the most common reason why System A would refuse to share data with System B is that they're not sure, the System A people are not sure if the System B people are capable of keeping the data that has been shared secure and private. So I think a data sharing agreement should provide some assurance on accountabilities and responsibilities between data sharing stakeholders. Having said that, it is actually easier said than done. Two independent entities sharing very sensitive data about patients would be very apprehensive in doing so. But two entities within a common governance structure, for example, in one hospital, between the Department of Radiology and the Department of Surgery, would be much easier because they all report to one governance structure. I think the complexity of data sharing and breach responsibilities and accountabilities result in more complexities when there are two or more differing governance structures that have to undertake an agreement to share data and to take shared responsibilities for a breach. Thank you for that question. I don't have a clear answer to the question except that the final data sharing agreement for this particular data sharing experiment will have to have a component on breach. Now, having said that, this data between St. Luke's and the University of the Philippines will not actually be real patient data, but rather dummy patient data, because they will be installing OpenIMIS in their school laboratory setting to understand how an electronic medical record and how an insurance management information system works. So they will not actually be using real patients when they are encoding. They will be using aliases and they will be using fake or dummy patient information for purposes of documenting the procedures that they do for the mannequins in their clinical skills lab. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Alvin. We have our second question. This is from Dr. Brent. It reads, can you give some examples of the document types that will or could be exchanged? Also, is the data to be retained by the recipient system, or is it being used only for a specific reason, like to determine eligibility or such, and not stored or retained?
So I'll answer the second question first. And so that's basically a discussion between the two systems, between the St. Luke system and the University of the Philippines system. Regarding the document type format, we don't intend to create a new format. We can either use CDA or HL7 Fire data sets. So those artifacts or existing open standards are what we plan to use in the exchange. And I think what will happen is that after the purpose and the rationale for the data sharing is agreed upon by the two parties, then we can lay down to them the different types of documents that could be exchanged, and what the purpose will be for the exchange will determine the content of the document. So I go back to the Mind the Gaps framework with the governance slash objective for data sharing becoming very prominent first step in determining the subsequent steps such as architecture, program management, and the standard selection. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Alvin. So to all our participants, if you have questions, please feel free to send them in. Thank you.
We also wish to ask the audience if they have any suggestions, if they already have any template data sharing agreements that we can use for this experiment. Right now, we have the Project Sequoia Dursa, which is very, very long, and we hope to look for something that is simpler for the Asian perspective. We're open to doing that. What I had planned to do was to get the Dursa and then ask the St. Luke's people and the University of the Philippines people to remove what they think are not necessary, and then what we will be ending up with would be a shortened or a more abstract Dursa for purposes of the data exchange between St. Luke's College of Medicine and the University of the Philippines. For purposes of this exchange, it will be for a hypothetical patient transferring from the St. Luke's Hospital, for example, to the University of the Philippines Hospital in the context of a universal healthcare system.
Thank you, Dr. Alvin. So far, there are no questions yet.
So I think, Charis, that's fine. So we can wrap it up, and then maybe, are you recording this webinar?
Yes, Dr. Alvin.
Okay, so we can share the recording to the rest of the AeHIN members and then open up more questions offline so that we can get more engagement, especially for people who were not able to join us tonight. Thank you to Pradeep and Brent for their questions. And we hope to see you again in the monthly OpenIMIS regional webinars. We will have major topics discussed during those monthly webinars, but we will insert 5 to 10 minute updates regarding this particular OpenIMIS data sharing experiments. And we hope to also involve the OpenIMIS architects, the OpenIMIS architecture team, so that as we undergo and undertake this data sharing experiment, we are also able to contribute to the OpenIMIS wiki regarding artifacts such as data sharing agreements, document type exchanges, and the results of the data exchange and the evaluation of the end users. Okay, chat, if there are no more questions, let's call it a night.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Alvin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. See you in the next webinar. Bye. Thank you, Charis.
Thank you, Dr. Alvin. Bye, everyone.
Good night. Bye.